the key to understanding that is to understand that it's a form of money, but it was never a monetary project. It was always a political project. And once you understand the political dynamics behind it, you can see that it's not going to break up. So getting back to the BRICS, what they need is to expand the membership. And by the way, that's exactly what they did on August 22nd. So I said August 22nd, the Leaders Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, and President Xi, President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, President Ramaphosa, President Lula of Brazil were all there. Putin would have been there, but there was an arrest warrant for his arrest from the International Criminal Court. So Putin didn't go. It's a distraction. And I said this would be a landmark or turning point in the development of the BRICS currency. And unfortunately for me, I actually have to read this stuff. And there's a 24-page single-space final communique from the BRICS Johannesburg Summit. And I read the whole thing. It barely mentions the new currency, just in passing in one section, kind of oblique, but barely mentions the new currency. And everyone said, hey, Jim, you said this was going to be a landmark in the development of the new currency. What happened? Well, the answer is it was. They did the thing they needed to do. It wasn't issuing a currency that was going to fail if you only had 5 members. They expanded the membership. They're now the BRICS 11. They added Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Egypt, and a couple other countries. So now they went from 5 to 11, but they've got a waiting list of like 20. Other countries waiting to apply: Algeria, Argentina, Malaysia, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who did they add? Well, when you put Russia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, and Brazil in the same group, who needs OPEC?
Jim Rickards sheds light on a strategic shift in the global economic landscape, emphasizing the growing influence of BRICS nations. With Russia, the second-largest oil producer globally, now part of BRICS, the consortium's combined oil output surpasses that of OPEC. The prospect of an expanded BRICS currency gains significance, offering member countries the ability to conduct trade in their own currency. The example of Russia selling oil to India and receiving payment in the BRICS currency highlights the potential for diversified trade beyond conventional norms. And then Jim Rickards envisions a broader membership, possibly reaching around 20 nations, enhancing the viability of the new currency. This approach echoes statements from figures like Lavrov, who previously hinted at the currency's establishment, although not explicitly gold-backed in a traditional sense. Jim Rickards underscores the geopolitical implications of this economic realignment, as BRICS nations position themselves for increased autonomy and collaboration, challenging established economic norms.
You've got more oil output in those 5 countries than you do in OPEC, because Russia is not a member of OPEC, and it's this second largest oil producer in the world. So OPEC is now inside the BRICS, or the OPEC power to set oil prices is now inside the BRICS. But more importantly, now that you're up to 11, and again, they're on their way to 20, given another year or whatever. So now you launch your BRICS currency, and you're Russia, and you sell oil to India. Instead of getting paid in rupees, you get paid in the BRICS currency. The difference is, instead of having to buy, whatever, rice from India, you can go shopping. You can go to Brazil and buy Embraer aircraft. You can go to China and buy semiconductors. You can go to Iran and buy drones. You can go to Argentina and buy, they have a lot of natural resources, et cetera. So can everybody else. China gets paid in the BRICS currency. They can buy oil from Saudi Arabia, the oil from Russia, et cetera, or Embraer from Brazil. They're very good aircraft. So the point being, when you expand the membership, you make not just the likelihood, but the feasibility of the new currency much, much greater. And so give them one more round. They'll invite in another 6 or 7 members next year. They'll get up to around 20, close to 20, which is about how many members you have in the European Monetary Zone, and then launch the currency to great success. So that's how it's playing out. The gold link, and this is what Lavrov said about 6 months ago, he never said it would be gold-backed in the sense that if you had some BRICS, you could march down to the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of Russia, and say, give me the gold. He never said that. And, again,
Jim Rickards delves into the intricacies of a potential new global currency and its ties to gold, drawing inspiration from John Maynard Keynes's proposals in 1944. However, Jim emphasizes that while some critics may nitpick the distinction between being gold-backed and gold-linked, the crucial point is determining the value of the currency in relation to gold. Using the hypothetical term brick for the currency, the argument underscores the uniqueness of this system, where one unit equals a specific weight of gold. The key insight lies in the currency's fixed value in terms of gold, employing the transitive law. This approach essentially places the burden on the US dollar to reflect the fluctuations in the global gold market. The genius, as pointed out, is that the issuing nation's BRICS can navigate this new monetary landscape without direct involvement in gold transactions. The prospect of a currency's value being pegged to gold adds an intriguing layer to global economic dynamics, with potential long-term consequences for the US dollar.
Again, I don't want to mention names, but, the usual suspects get all spun up over this and they're on all these programs. He never said that. What he said was that it was not gold backed, but gold linked. And what he meant by that, and he was specific. He said, because you have to ask yourself, what's the value of a brick? One brick. I call it a brick. I don't know what they're going to call it. Maybe the Bancorp in honor of John Maynard Keynes. By the way, everything I'm talking about is what Keynes proposed at Bretton Woods in 1944. It was all shut down by the United States, by Harry Dexter White, who was a Stalinist agent. But this is basically the return is the ghost of John Maynard Keynes, because what the Russians are doing is exactly what Keynes wanted to do. He wanted a world currency, not a US dollar. But what Lavrov said is that, okay, we're going to define the value of one, I'll call it a brick. One brick is going to equal weight of gold. And he didn't say what the weight is. I say one brick equals 1 ounce. That's just for illustration purposes. It doesn't matter. You can call it a Bancorp, you can say it's a kilo. It doesn't matter. All of a sudden, you have a currency that is the value of which is determined not by reference to another currency, but by reference to gold. Now, you say, well, okay, but what does that mean out in the real world? Well, there's a dollar market in gold. The global market in gold is dollar denominated. You can buy it in other currencies, in a store or something like that, but it's pretty much a dollar market. So now we're back to Aristotle, who created syllogisms and logic, father of logic, and the transitive law. So if one brick equals 1 ounce, again, just for illustration, and 1 ounce equals a certain number of dollars, today it's, 1950, up and down, whatever, then with the transitive law, you can say, well, one brick equals $1,900. But here's the key. It's not a fixed exchange rate. As the dollar price of gold fluctuates, the value of a brick as a weight of gold will not fluctuate. It's fixed as a weight of gold. But using the transitive law, the dollar value will fluctuate. But it means the U.S. has to do all the dirty work. In other words, this is the genius of the Russians. They can just free ride on the dollar gold market. They don't have to intervene. They don't have to buy gold. They don't have to sell gold. They don't even have to have gold. You just say, this is what it's worth, and then let the dollar do all the dirty work. With one footnote, which is if you're the issuer of bricks or the holder of bricks and it's worth a weight of gold, what do you want to happen to the price of gold? Well, you want it to go to the moon because you're destroying the dollar through the transitive law and through the dollar-denominated gold market. That's for the long run. The Fed's looking at unemployment. It's based on the so-called Phillips curve. It says, unemployment's down, inflation's up. If unemployment's up, inflation's down. That's the Phillips curve. You can draw it, and the Fed's using that to guide policy. The Phillips curve is garbage, and it's not a personal insult against Professor Phillips. It's the case that there's no empirical support for it. I could give you examples going back to the 1930s of low unemployment, low inflation, which we had in the early 60s. 1930s, we had high unemployment, low inflation, even deflation. Late 1970s, what did we have? High unemployment and high inflation. That was called stagflation. So I can give you examples. If you think of it as a quad chart, unemployment, inflation, fill in the blanks. I can give you all 4 examples: low, 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 high, high, low, high, high, which means there's no correlation. If you can have any one of them, there's no correlation. So the Phillips curve has no predictive value on its face because the data doesn't back it up. Last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was a flat line. At least where I went to school, curves were not flat, but there it is. Now, it's worse than that because Unemployment, even if you thought it was a good indicator of something, particularly inflation, it's a lagging indicator or a lagging indicator of recession, as the case may be. So let's say you're an employer, a business person. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. I start businesses. When you're in a tough spot, when revenues are down and things are slowing down, margins are getting compressed and all that, the last thing you want to do is fire people because it took a while to find them, hire them, train them. You don't want to let them go. You do everything else. Like you turn down the lights, you call your landlord, negotiate a cheaper rent, slow pay your creditors, drive a hard bargain on something. You do everything else to maintain your margins. And then only when all else fails do you start firing people. So first of all, it's a lagging indicator. You're already in the recession before you get around to firing people, number one. Number two, because you held on so long, you tend to do it en masse. It's not like I'm going to fire one person a month for the next year. It's like I'm going to hang on to all of them and then maybe, sadly, fire them all at once because I have no other choice. So A, it's a lagging indicator. B, it can turn on a dime from very low unemployment to very high unemployment within a matter of months. And if that's what the Fed's relying on, which they are, they say so. It's not a guess. They say that's what we're watching. Two things. Number one, you're not going to see the recession coming. It's a lagging indicator, and it can go from kind of good to bad almost overnight. So the Fed's, driving this way, looking out the back window, and they're probably going to wreck the economy. But there are a lot of other signs to say, okay, Jim, unemployment's not a good measure, and it isn't. But how do you know what are the good metrics? They tend to be a little technical. They tend to be things that very few people look at, but they're there. They're not secret. The big one, I think this gets more notice, is an inverted Treasury yield curve. Well, what does that mean? So a normal yield curve, it's like the longer the maturity, the higher the rate. That's common sense. So if I'm going to lend somebody money for a month, I might charge a certain interest rate, but if I'm going to lend you money for 10 years, I want a much higher interest rate because there's a lot more risk, inflation, default, credit risk, who knows what. So a normal yield curve is upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the higher the rate. Okay, right now, yield curves are inverted, which means they're downward sloping, which means the longer the maturity, the lower the rate. Why would you take a lower rate on a 10-year Treasury note than you would on an overnight loan, that's where we are today, by the way. So in other words, this is the big money. This is the institutional money. This is people who know more than central bankers in many cases, betting that interest rates are going to come down a lot. Because if they weren't, that inverted yield curve would make no sense. And so they're betting that the economy is going into a severe recession. Interest rates are going to drop. Now, just to get a little more arcane, there's something called the SOFR futures curve. SOFR is the new LIBOR. There were problems with LIBOR. But these are long-term bets on overnight rates. Treasury is a snapshot of what I think the 10-year rate is going to be, but the SOFR is the opposite. They trade in strips, quarterly settlements that go out 3 or 4 years, 5 years, but the longer ones aren't that liquid. But basically, I can make a bet as to what I think the overnight rate is going to be 1 year from today. That yield curve is also steeply inverted. And again, this is the real, who trades SOFR futures? Well, the institutions and central banks and the big money, in other words. And it's in the data. It's not a guess. You can look at it. It's publicly available. And it says rates are going to drop steeply in the months and year ahead. So again, these are, when you have an inverted SOFR yield curve, an inverted Treasury yield curve, it's basically the big money betting the rates are going to drop like a stone. Well, why would that be? Well, there are only two reasons. One, a severe recession and a steep drop in inflation. And those two things do go together. One more example, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there's something, the Fed has an overnight reverse repo facility. What does that mean? So the Fed says, hey, give me your cash and I'll give you a Treasury bill as collateral, and then we'll unwind it at some point in the future. It's called a reverse repo. So I can call up the Fed, have them send me Treasury bills as collateral, give them cash, and they'll pay me interest on that. It's a phone call. I don't have to do anything fancy. Okay, but the Treasury also sells Treasury bills at auction, and I can bid on them, and people do. And the yield to maturity on those is lower than the Fed will give you for a phone call. So why would you bid at an auction, take the market risk, and get a yield that's lower than the one you can get for a phone call? Well, the answer is that the Treasury bill that they send me when I do the Treasury facility, I cannot rehypothecate it, meaning I have to hold it, give it back to the Fed when they want it, but I can't give it to you or anybody else. Whereas if I bid at auction, I can take that bill, I can pledge it to UBS, UBS can pledge it to Deutsche Bank can pledge it to Barclays, and they do. So, but the reason I bid more aggressively for that and take a lower yield, I'm fighting for a lower yield instead of the higher yield I can get for free, is because I need the collateral. That's a sign that there's a collateral shortage, that banks are reducing their balance sheets, they're unwinding derivatives, et cetera. So sorry to be a little technical, but the point is when you look at two inverted yield curves and an auction rate that's lower than what you can get for a phone call, they all say the same thing. Rates are going down, the economy is going to crash, and there's collateral scarcity, and banks are tightening up their balance sheets. So they're all bad signs. It reminds me of another indicator, just quickly. Swap rates we have negative swap rates. What does that mean? Well, what is a swap? So I buy a 10-year treasury note and I finance it in the overnight market. So what's happening to me? I'm getting the yield on the 10-year treasury note and I'm paying an overnight real. So I'm receiving fixed, paying floating. Well, sometime in the 80s, in my experience, at some point somebody said, hey, why don't we get rid of the bond? Like, just pay fixed and receive floating. Who needs the bond? The bond's a piece of collateral, but we can have a contract. So that's a swap, a simple form of swap. So I do a swap with Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank says, okay, Jim, I'll pay you the 10-year rate. You pay me the overnight rate. It's exactly the same as if you had the note and we're financing it in the repo market. It's just receive fixed, pay floating. That's a swap. But if you think of the credit risk, at least with the 10-year treasury note, I got the United States government behind me. If I'm doing a swap with, UBS, I got bank risk. I've got some credit risk in the bank. Credit Suisse just failed. So it's logical. It makes sense that the rate I get from UBS should be slightly higher than the treasury rate. The swap rate from a bank should be slightly higher than the comparable maturity of a government security, because the government security is slightly safer than a big bank. Well, right now, that's not true. UBS, or I'm picking on UBS, Barclays, anybody else in a swap, the rate I get is lower than I get from a 10-year treasury note. So why would I do that? Why would I take the poorer credit and take a lower rate instead of a higher rate? Well, the answer is the swap is off balance sheet, and the treasury note, if I own it, I got to put it on my balance sheet. So when you see negative swap rates, meaning the riskier credit is paying you less than the government credit, what it means is that the balance sheets are constrained. I got to do the off balance sheet trade because we can't use up the balance sheets. That's consistent with what we just talked about with the inverted yield curves, which is there's a major credit contraction. There's a collateral shortage, a dollar shortage, and a credit contraction. That's not a recipe for recession. I don't know what it is. In the US, we have a $100 bill. That's our largest denomination. When I was a teenager, the US had a $500 bill, and they were in circulation. You could get them. So they eliminated that in 1968, no more $500 bill. And from then on, the $100 bill was the largest denomination. But the difference between then and now is that in 1968, a $100 bill was worth $100. If you adjust for inflation, the $100 bill of 1968 is worth about $20 in purchasing power in today's money. So we're already at a point where our largest denomination is worth $20 in purchasing power, at least compared to the 60s, $100 nominally, but it's greatly shrunk. So we don't have much cash. And by the way, if you want $1 million in $100 bills, it weighs exactly 22 pounds, and it fits in an attaché case, $1 million in $100 bills. People look at me funny. They go, Jim, how come you know that? Well, first of all, I do know that, but it's really just a math problem, because one bill, whether it's a 1 or 100, but I'm using hundreds because it's the biggest, weighs a gram. So, it's basically 10 grams or 10 kilograms, 10 kilos, or 22.2 pounds. The point being, we're very far down the road to get them into cash anyway, but you can still do it. You can get your 22 pounds and have your $1 million in cash. So why are they so driven to eliminate cash? What's that got to do with central bank digital currency? Well, now we get into the purpose of the central bank digital currency. And the metaphor I've used is that if you want to slaughter pigs, you have to get all the pigs into a cattle chute and run them into the slaughterhouse and then slaughter them. You can't just let them, run around. You got to herd them up and get them into a cattle chute, or cows for that matter. And so if they want to slaughter savers and investors, they have to get you into a digital slaughterhouse. And that's what digital money is all about. If you can't have cash and you can only have the central bank digital currency, then everyone's got to have a digital account. And once they've got you in the system, of course, they know who you are because it's all digital, and they keep the ledger. Back to the ledger. What can they do? Well, they can impose negative interest rates. So you have $100,000 at 1% interest. You go away for a year, you come back, you should have $101,000. But with a negative interest rate of 1%, you go away, come back in a year, and you'd have $99,000. Well, cash is an easy way around that. At least you bury it in your backyard, but at least you'd have the $100,000 in my example a year later. But with a digital account, they can actually take it out of your account. Number one. Number two, they can put a timestamp or an expiration date on your money and say, okay, here's your money that's in your account, but if you don't spend 10% of it in the next 30 days, we're going to impose a 2% penalty. We're going to take it away basically if you don't spend it. Oh, what does that do? It kind of forces you to spend it. Is that a kind of stimulus? Maybe, I'm not sure. These things don't usually work out as the eggheads plan, but the idea would be if we don't have enough what Keynes called aggregate demand, we'll force people to go buy stuff by telling them if you don't spend it, you lose it. Use it or lose it kind of thing. Okay. Withholding taxes. Now, again, in the United States, I think it's similar in Australia. If you have a job, quote unquote, your regular payday, whatever, they pay you, but they deduct the withholding tax at the source, and it's based on the rate. So maybe it's, 20%. So you make $1,000, they take out $200, and here's the $800 net to you. And then at the end of the year, they give you a statement, you file your tax return, and you claim the withholding, and you reconcile your taxes. But that's not true for independent contractors, doctors, lawyers, professionals, writers, anyone who you earn a living, you work, right? But you don't have any withholding tax, but you still have the money still goes in your bank account. Well, now they can just impose the tax on your bank account. Say, well, hey, we see your inflows here. You make a nice living. We're going to take 20% of that. Again, send your tax receipt, and file your tax return and sort it out at the end of the year. That would come as a shock to a lot of doctors and lawyers. So negative interest rates and withholding taxes are two things that are hard to impose if in a world of cash and non-central bank digital currencies, but they're easy in a world of no cash and central bank digital currencies. Well, it gets worse. This is the culmination, just kind of cut to the chase. This is the culmination of the total surveillance state. We already have facial recognition software, very good. It's like your face is like a fingerprint. Everyone's a little different. You say, well, that's okay. I'm going to put a mask on because COVID, and sunglasses, and pull a hat down to my forehead. You'll never see my face. You know what? They have gait recognition software, GAIT, meaning how you walk. Everybody walks differently. Was it that Monty Python thing, the mystery of silly walks? Well, silly or not, everybody walks differently. And so they can actually digitally identify you just by the way you walk. And so your mask isn't going to help you. And with GPS, I have a bunch of what are called Faraday sacks. They're, some of them are nice, they're leather wallets, but they're basically lined with a certain metallic fibers that block radiation. So if you want to turn your cell phone off, put it in a Faraday sack, and by the way, do the same with your Easy Pass and any other things sending out radiation, which are ubiquitous. Maybe they can't follow you around, but most people don't do that, and they do. And so with your iPhone, they know where you are at all times. You may be looking at a map trying to find a good restaurant, but they're tracking you. So they already do that. But now they take it a step further. So you're at the point of purchase, you're buying a book. Let's say it's a book that criticizes Kevin Rudd, for example. He's your leading panda hugger down in Australia, or in the United States, criticizes Joe Biden or something, or, Ultra MAGA hamburger, whatever it is. Well, Ultra MAGA, you're an extremist, you're a radical, you're part of the insurrection. So now we're going to freeze your account or deny the purchase or put you on a watch list, or we just appropriated money to hire 87,000 armed IRS, Internal Revenue Service agents. Maybe we'll assign one to you because you bought the wrong book. So now we're into thought control. We're into basically subduing your political enemies because well, if you give money to a certain political candidate, again, perfectly legal stuff. Buy a book, make a donation, that's legal. But they don't like who you're doing it with. And they meaning the government, they're watching. They know what you're reading and by inference, what you're thinking, who you're giving money to, what causes you support, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't take much these days to have some, kind of low IQ spokesperson at the White House label you as an extremist. So this is all government's ever wanted, was total control of the people. Makes Louis the 14th look like a very hands-off kind of guy.
But Jim, the government would never do these things. The tax office would never target a political group. They would never target a group of people because of donations to different causes. They would never target protesters in any way. They would never target someone who's doesn't want to get vaccinated in any way. None of these things would ever happen.
Well, I know you're being actually very serious, but I know that's more rhetorical. The fact is, not only will they happen, they have happened, they are happening. This is the world we live in. That's absolutely the case. And let me give some concrete examples, because I don't put stuff like that out there without backing up. So in 2010, the IRS targeted what we call in the United States the Tea Party movement. This was the first midterm of President Obama's first term in office. Historically, a time when the president's party loses a lot of seats. It's not even Democrats versus Republicans. It's just a consistent pattern of first term president, first midterm election, they lose seats. Obama lost almost a record number of seats, something like 63 or 64 seats versus an historical average closer to 30. Because of people were upset about Obamacare, they were upset about the tax increases, the bailouts coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis favored the rich, hurt the poor. There was just a lot of people were having second thoughts about voting for Obama in the first place. So we had this Tea Party movement, and they just kicked butt in the 2010 election. Well, so these were springing up everywhere. This was a genuine grassroots movement. There was no nationwide top-down organization. Communities were like, hey, let's start our own branch of the Tea Party, et cetera. And because they qualified as nonprofit organizations, there's some rules around that, but you have to apply to the IRS, our Internal Revenue Service, for a designation and a number proving that you're a nonprofit organization. Well, the person in charge of those was slow rolling all the applications. They weren't getting approved. They were entitled to it. That the IRS intervened to squash the formation of Tea Party movements from coast to coast for political reasons, plain and simple. Well, that was 12 years ago, and there was no central bank digital currency. Imagine how much more powerful that kind of corruption is today. There were $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. These are mortgages that, no documentation, don't have to prove your income, very non-credit worthy. But there was a bubble mentality, a frenzy, and everyone, hey, buy a house and borrow money, fix it up, sell it for twice as much, walk away rich, and everybody was doing it. Mortgage default rates rarely get above 5%. 5% is really high in the mortgage market. So people were saying, smart people like Ben Stein, the financial analyst, but the central bank and others were like, well, okay, let's get crazy. Let's assume a 20% default rate, which has never happened, but just assume that's true. On $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, a 20% default rate would be a $200 billion loss, which was only slightly higher than the S&L crisis of the 1980s. Adjusted for inflation, it would have been a comparable loss. And the attitude was, well, we survived the 80s, we'll survive this. Yeah, it's bad, banks will take losses, stock prices go down a little bit, but we'll survive. What they missed is, yes, there was $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, but there were $6 trillion of derivatives. Yeah. That was invisible. So all of a sudden, 20% of that was $1.2 trillion. So you create derivatives out of thin air, yeah. And there's no limit on how many you can have. They're off balance sheet, meaning give me the balance sheet of the company, I won't see them. You have to read the footnotes and then the information behind the footnotes. So non-transparent, unregulated, no limit on size. So the crisis was actually much worse than anyone realized. And then when it started to collapse, the contagion spread throughout the financial system. My point about 2008, it was because we did not learn the lessons of 1998, and we flew right into 2008. But once again, we have not learned the lessons of 2008, and we're going to fly right into the next storm. In 1998, Wall Street got together and bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks got together and bailed out Wall Street. Who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, the point is each crisis is bigger than the one before. The intervention gets elevated, larger dollar amounts. And are we now at the point where there's no one left to bail us out? And one of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, okay, Jim, I kind of follow your analysis on how risk works and how complexity theory and capital markets, how that works. But where's the crisis coming from? What's going to be the catalyst? It's actually a long list. Now, student loans, there are $1.6 trillion worth of student loans. So this will go, and kind of this gets to your point, Francis, how do capital markets and money markets and Fed policy kind of leach into debt and deficits? So when a lender, credit union, or anybody, or university makes a loan to a student, and the Treasury guarantees that loan, which they do, it's off budget. Again, it's not strictly a derivative, but it is non-transparent. So then the student defaults, and the credit union, the lender, simply turns to the Treasury and said, here's your loan file, pay me. And the Treasury pays the lender because they've guaranteed the loan. Now it's on the Treasury. But until that point, that loss is not on the books of the United States government. That loss is not part of the deficit. But when the Treasury writes the check to make good on the guarantee, it does go into the deficit. So we think deficits are high now, but there's this $1 trillion tsunami of student loan losses that's going to pile on top of the structural deficits and make it even worse. So all these things are, I spend all my time analyzing these things. I see them all. I can describe them. I can see how they're going to converge into a worse crisis. But in the short run, people either ignore them or they just don't know anything about them. But why would Bernie Sanders even suggest that? And by the way, he's not alone. I think the other candidates have, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, one way or another, have suggested that they would do something similar, that we need student loan relief, and that ends up going onto the budget and onto the taxpayers. But there's a school of economics, and I talked about this in chapter 5 of my book. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT for short. Everyday viewers, everyday people to know anything about it, but more to the point, economists don't know anything about it. This is a new school of economics, if you want to think of it that way. So there is this modern monetary theory, but the leading scholar of modern monetary theory is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor at the State University of New York, but she's the financial advisor to Bernie Sanders. What modern monetary theory says is that actually there's no limit on the amount you can spend. You can spend as much as you want, and the market will either buy the debt, or if they balk, the Fed will monetize the debt. So how much debt is there relative to the size of the economy? This is called the debt to GDP ratio, but the way it's a simple fraction you learn in the 5th grade. How much debt divided by the size of the economy? So in a simple example, if you had $5 trillion of debt and a $10 trillion economy, that fraction would be 1/2. So you would say the debt to GDP ratio is 1/2 or 50%. Today, the debt is larger than the economy. Yep. That ratio is over 100%. We have round numbers, about $23 trillion of debt and about a $22 trillion economy. So the ratio is about 105%, highest since World War II. That troubles me, it troubles other economists. But my friend Stephanie says, what's the problem? You could take it to 150%, 200%. 250%. By the way, that's where Japan is. Japan's at 250%. Greece is 175% or so. Italy's 135%. They're all still standing. Go to the Ginza, it looks like Times Square. So you don't see visible signs of stress. And here's the irony. Ben Bernanke would absolutely not agree with this theory, and he said so publicly. But Professor Kelton says to Bernanke, you proved our point. You were the one who took the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupled it from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion or so. You proved that you can print trillions of dollars of money without causing inflation, without causing high interest rates, without causing a run on the bank. So all we're saying is, you did it to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus. We wanted to do it to forgive student loans. We may have different policy objectives, but the process is the same. What's the problem? Now, of all the things I've debated, for years I was dragged into Bitcoin versus gold debates, which I thought were silly. I mean, I don't like Bitcoin. I do like gold, but it's like fish versus bicycles. I mean, the debate never made sense to me, even though I did a lot of them. Of all the things I've had to rebut, this was actually the most difficult because it's superficially appealing. First of all, legally, it is true that the Fed can take their balance sheet as high as they want. There's no legal limit on the Fed's ability to print money. It is true that Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, and they're still standing. It is true that the Treasury can borrow as much as they want, subject to periodic increases in the debt ceiling, which have never been denied. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So all the elements of the thesis are actually correct. So how do you refute it? And the answer is that legally it can be done. And if your goal is to print a lot of money and forgive student loans or give a guaranteed job or guaranteed basic income, whatever it is, in theory you could do that. But there is an invisible psychological boundary, and this is what the modern monetary theorists don't understand, and I don't think Ben Bernanke understands it. There comes a time when people wake up and they say, I don't know what's going on here. I don't have a PhD, but get me out of the dollar. It doesn't. And so, I'll buy gold, I'll buy silver, land, oil, natural resources, buy a new car, buy a house. Get me out of the dollar into something tangible, because I no longer trust the monetary authorities. I no longer trust the Congress. I can't believe that you're going to spend this much money without ceiling, without limit, without causing inflation. My inflationary expectations will go up. And the way to deal with that is to buy hard assets, starting with gold, but not exclusively gold. There, as I say, land, real estate, and natural resources. They're all good. They're all good substitutes. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket. All of a sudden, the bond market will have difficulty selling it. The president of the Congress could take away some of the Fed's independence. All of these assumptions could come crashing down very quickly, very unexpectedly, and that's the problem with the theory. There were $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. These are mortgages that, no documentation, don't have to prove your income, very non-credit worthy. But there was a bubble mentality, a frenzy, and everyone, hey, buy a house and borrow money, fix it up, sell it for twice as much, walk away rich, and everybody was doing it. Mortgage default rates rarely get above 5%. 5% is really high in the mortgage market. So people were saying, smart people like Ben Stein, a financial analyst, but the central bank and others were like, well, okay, let's get crazy. Let's assume a 20% default rate, which has never happened, but just assume that's true. On $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, a 20% default rate would be a $200 billion loss, which was only slightly higher than the S&L crisis of the 1980s. Adjusted for inflation, it would have been a comparable loss. And the attitude was, well, we survived the 80s, we'll survive this. Yeah, it's bad, banks will take losses, stock prices go down a little bit, but we'll survive. What they missed is, yes, there was $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, but there were $6 trillion of derivatives. Yeah. That was invisible. So all of a sudden, 20% of that was $1.2 trillion. So you create derivatives out of thin air. Yeah. And there's no limit on how many you can have. They're off balance sheet, meaning give me the balance sheet of the company, I won't see them. You have to read the footnotes and then the information behind the footnotes. So non-transparent, unregulated, no limit on size. So the crisis was actually much worse than anyone realized. And then when it started to collapse, the contagion spread throughout the financial system. My point about 2008, it was because we did not learn the lessons of 1998, and we flew right into 2008. But once again, we have not learned the lessons of 2008, and we're going to fly right into the next storm. In 1998, Wall Street got together and bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks got together and bailed out Wall Street. Who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, the point is each crisis is bigger than the one before. The intervention gets elevated, larger dollar amounts. And are we now at the point where there's no one left to bail us out? And one of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, okay, Jim, I kind of follow your analysis on how risk works and how complexity theory and capital markets, how that works. But where's the crisis coming from? What's going to be the catalyst? It's actually a long list. Now, student loans, there are $1.6 trillion worth of student loans. So this will go, and kind of this gets to your point, Francis, how do capital markets and money markets and Fed policy kind of leach into debt and deficits? So when a lender, credit union, or anybody a university makes a loan to a student and the Treasury guarantees that loan, which they do, it's off budget. Again, it's not strictly a derivative, but it is non-transparent. So then the student defaults, and the credit union, the lender, simply turns to the Treasury and said, here's your loan file, pay me. And the Treasury pays the lender because they've guaranteed the loan. Now it's on the Treasury. But until that point, that loss is not on the books of the United States government. That loss is not part of the deficit. But when the Treasury writes the check to make good on the guarantee, it does go into the deficit. So we think deficits are high now, but there's this $1 trillion tsunami of student loan losses that's going to pile on top of the structural deficits and make it even worse. So all these things are, I spend all my time analyzing these things. I see them all. I can describe them. I can see how they're going to converge into a worse crisis. But in the short run, people either ignore them or they just don't know anything about them. But why would Bernie Sanders even suggest that? And by the way, he's not alone. I think the other candidates of, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, one way or another, have suggested that they would do something similar, that we need student loan relief, and that ends up going onto the budget and onto the taxpayers. But there's a school of economics, and I talk about this in chapter 5 of my book. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT for short. Everyday viewers, everyday people to know anything about it, but more to the point, economists don't know anything about it. This is a new school of economics, if you want to think of it that way. So there is this modern monetary theory, but the leading scholar of modern monetary theory is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor at the State University of New York, but she's the financial advisor to Bernie Sanders. What modern monetary theory says is that actually there's no limit on the amount you can spend. You can spend as much as you want, and the market will either buy the debt, or if they balk, the Fed will monetize the debt. So how much debt is there relative to the size of the economy? This is called the debt to GDP ratio, but the way it's a simple fraction you learn in the 5th grade. How much debt divided by the size of the economy? So in a simple example, if you had $5 trillion of debt and a $10 trillion economy, that fraction would be 1/2. So you would say the debt to GDP ratio is 1/2 or 50%. Today, the debt is larger than the economy. Yep. That ratio is over 100%. We have round numbers, about $23 trillion of debt and about a $22 trillion economy. So the ratio is about 105%, highest since World War II. That troubles me, it troubles other economists. But my friend Stephanie says, what's the problem? You could take it to 150%, 200%. 250%. By the way, that's where Japan is. Japan's at 250%. Greece is 175% or so. Italy's 135%. They're all still standing. Go to the Ginza, it looks like Times Square. So you don't see visible signs of stress. And here's the irony. Ben Bernanke would absolutely not agree with this theory, and he said so publicly. But Professor Kelton says to Bernanke, you proved our point. You were the one who took the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupled it from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion or so. You proved that you can print trillions of dollars of money without causing inflation, without causing high interest rates, without causing a run on the bank. So all we're saying is, you did it to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus. We wanted to do it to forgive student loans. We may have different policy objectives, but the process is the same. What's the problem? Now, of all the things I've debated, for years I was dragged into Bitcoin versus gold debates, which I thought were silly. I mean, I don't like Bitcoin, I do like gold, but it's like fish versus bicycles. I mean, the debate never made sense to me, even though I did a lot of them. Of all the things I've had to rebut, this was actually the most difficult because it's superficially appealing. First of all, legally, it is true that the Fed can take their balance sheet as high as they want. There's no legal limit on the Fed's ability to print money. It is true that Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, and they're still standing. It is true that the Treasury can borrow as much as they want, subject to periodic increases in the debt ceiling, which have never been denied. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So all the elements of the thesis are actually correct. So how do you refute it? And the answer is that legally it can be done. And if your goal is to print a lot of money and forgive student loans or give a guaranteed job or guaranteed basic income, whatever it is, in theory, you could do that. But there is an invisible psychological boundary. And this is what the modern monetary theorists don't understand, and I don't think Ben Bernanke understands it. There comes a time when people wake up and they say, I don't know what's going on here. I don't have a PhD, but get me out of the dollar. It doesn't. And so, I'll buy gold, I'll buy silver, land, oil, natural resources, buy a new car, buy a house. Get me out of the dollar into something tangible, because I no longer trust the monetary authorities. I no longer trust the Congress. I can't believe that you're going to spend this much money without ceiling, without limit, without causing inflation. My inflationary expectations will go up. And the way to deal with that is to buy hard assets, starting with gold, but not exclusively gold. There, as I say, land, real estate, and natural resources. They're all good. They're all good substitutes. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket. All of a sudden, the bond market will have difficulty selling it. The president of the Congress could take away some of the Fed's independence. All these assumptions could come crashing down very quickly, very unexpectedly, and that's the problem with the theory. What's coming is a very severe recession. The monetary tightening on top of a world where growth is deaccelerating, inventories are sky high. The funny thing about the supply chain, we all remember headline, supply chain's broken down, the shelves are bare. So all true, that was happening at the time. And that's when I started working on the book. But what a lot of purchasing managers did, and inventory managers, they doubled their orders. They said, or tripled the orders. They said, if the supply chain's breaking down and I want just a normal amount, I better order 3 times as much or twice as much just to get what I want. And they did. Well, what happened was by the summer, some of that pressure had been alleviated, and here come the shipments into the warehouses that are twice as much or 3 times as much as what you needed at the exact same time that the Fed was destroying demand. And so demand drops off a cliff, retail sales drop off a cliff, the warehouses go from being empty to being full to the rafters, and now all that merchandise is sitting there. So, Nike, just many examples. So what do you do when you're in charge of inventory? You cut prices. You don't want that inventory. It costs a lot of money to keep it in the warehouses, number one. Number two, a lot of it's seasonal. It's like, who wants to buy, a summer dress in December? Not too many people. So they just slash prices, and that reduces margins and reduces profits. So we're just kind of flying into the face of all that. With the Fed tightening rates into weakness. The Fed will be the last to know, because they're very model driven and the models are badly flawed, mostly with the Phillips curve and their focus on the unemployment rate, which is not a good measure of what's going on in the labor force. So we're flying into a really bad recession. But you've got this pivot narrative you can't quite get rid of. Some of the buy the dips people are still around, so count on them to buy into what could be a horrendous bear market. You got your buy and hold crowd. Remember in 2000, 2001, the NASDAQ dropped 80%. And a lot of people got out, but they said, well, just hold on to it. Well, it did come back, but it took until 2015. That's a long time. A lot of people died in the meantime. You're waiting 14 years to get back to where you were. So those people are still around, but there is what I call the pivot crowd. So the Fed pivot is a narrative, and it kind of goes like this. Yeah, the Fed's tightening. We see that. Inflation is going to come down really fast. The economy is going to slow down really fast. Both of those things are happening. Inflation, a little less so, but the economic slowdown is there. And the Fed's going to get the wake-up call and have to cut rates. And cutting rates, that's the pivot. They're going to pivot from rate hikes to rate cuts. And that's good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. Now, that's the narrative. There are 2 huge fallacies in that narrative. The first one is who says the Fed's going to get the message? And if you look at what Jay Powell said and what he repeated, we're going to raise rates, we're going to crush inflation. I've been following this for 50 years. I've never seen a Fed chairman use the word pain 3 times in one paragraph, but he did, and he meant it. He knows there's going to be a recession. They're causing it in part. Unemployment's going to go up. He said that. He tied unemployment to killing, basically demand destruction and getting inflation under control. He said, that's how we're going to do it. And you're already starting to see some early signs of that. So with that as their focus, who says the Fed's going to, get a wake-up call? Almost certainly not. They told us what they're going to do. They're going to raise rates. And then he said, if we see progress on inflation, will pause. But pause doesn't mean cut. It means just wait a long time, because at that point, core PCE, that's personal consumption expenditure, core, which excludes oil and food, and that's just how they do it. That's their favorite metric. You can debate whether it's the best one, but the debate doesn't matter because that is the one they use. Let's say that comes down to around 3.5. Okay, it's still not 2. Now, what Powell, which is their target, so what Powell said is, we don't have to keep raising rates to force it to 2. We just have to raise them enough that it'll get to 2 on its own. That's what they call restrictive policy. So, but that's not a rate cut. He said that might last for a year, all the way into 2024. That's when he was talking about rate cuts. Now, again, this can change, but they've told us what they're going to do. I always say, forecasting the Fed's the easiest thing I do, because they actually tell you what you're going to do, what they're going to do. You just have to listen and believe them. Now, the hard part is understanding how badly they're going to destroy the economy and when they're going to get the wake-up call. That's the hard part of the analysis. But telling you what they're going to do is the easy part, because they kind of tell you. So the stock market notion that somehow they'll be cutting rates is just false. But the second fallacy is even bigger: is tell me why it's a buy signal for stocks if the Fed is throwing the economy into such a bad recession that unemployment is going to go up significantly and growth is going to come down, inflation is going to come down. Why is that a buy signal for stocks? Bear market rallies are really interesting. Some of the biggest rallies in history have been in the middle of bear markets, where you ended up losing everything, but for a couple of days or weeks even, it's the bottom's in, and you buy stocks, etc. So you have to watch out for that. So my expectation is the recession's coming. It's going to be really bad. Inflation is going to come down fast, but not quite fast enough for the Fed. They're going to keep raising rates, destroying demand, raising unemployment, and we're going to wake up with a severe recession, high unemployment, and a much lower stock market. I was around for the 2008 financial crisis. I was around for 1998 financial crisis. I negotiated that bailout for LTCM. 98 was interesting because it was an acute financial crisis that came very close, within hours, actually. And I was in the room with the Treasury and Italian finance ministry and 19 banks and a thundering herd of lawyers trying to save the world. But we came within hours of shutting every market in the world. There was a $4 billion all cash. You couldn't use the word due diligence because there wasn't time. It was just, hey, the Fed wants us to do this, so let's just do it. So that worked, but it was a very close call. They would have shut down Tokyo and then around the world, London, and finally New York. And they would have opened days later. But that's how, with trillions of dollars of losses, it would have been worse than what actually happened in 2008. It didn't happen. But there was no economic recession at the time. That confuses a lot of people, because, and particularly if you're using 2008 as a frame of reference, there are financial panics and financial crises and liquidity crises, and there are recessions, some of which are severe. But they're two different things. 98 was an acute financial crisis with no recession. 2000 was a mild recession, but there was no severe financial crisis. Now, NASDAQ collapsed, but there wasn't a lot of leverage in NASDAQ. There was no contagion there, but it didn't spread because no banks failed, no major brokerages failed, et cetera. So in 1990, a mild recession, but no financial panic. October 19, 1987, interesting, stock market fell 22% in one day. Not a week or a month, but one day, down 22%. And that was a financial crisis, but there was no recession. So they're separate things. However, they can happen together. And 2008 was an example. There we had both. But I would encourage analysts to separate those two things. Again, they came together. It was horrific, but they can happen separately. My point is, we may have a very bad recession, possibly worse than 2008. But 2008 is a model, and that may be what we're heading for, bearing in mind that these are two separate vectors. I'm going to spend $50 billion to create 51% of the mining capacity in the world, and I'm going to steal all the Bitcoin in the world and take down the Western financial system. First of all, there's no such thing as cryptocurrency. There are 1,000 cryptocurrencies. In other words, you cannot speak generically about cryptocurrencies. Jim Rickards hates cryptocurrencies. That's not true. I really, really dislike Bitcoin, and I'll tell you why. But there are cryptocurrencies out there that I think are very interesting and worth your consideration. I'm for it. I'm against it. Cryptocurrency means nothing. You have to talk about the specific currency. And I'm showing Bitcoin, Litecoin, Monero, and Ether. By the way, isn't it fascinating how the graphical representation of cryptocurrencies is always a gold or silver coin? Bitcoin's gold and Litecoin's silver, Monero's both, and Ether is gold. I mean, what are they trying to say? I think that psychologically what they're saying is, well, this is nothing, but if we pretend it's a gold coin, then someone will buy it. But I just find this a little bit of an aside. But no, it's the same thing is true with fiat currencies. You can't be like or dislike fiat currencies generically. Some people do because they just hate central banks. I understand that. But it's a big difference between a Venezuelan bolivar and a euro. Big difference between a Zimbabwe dollar and a U.S. dollar. So in other words, don't talk to me about cryptocurrencies. Tell me what specific one you want to talk about, and that's a more interesting conversation. I think it's really important because this field is so muddied. The conversation is so muddied. People not distinguishing between blockchain and currency, not distinguishing between different types of currencies, et cetera. I think we need to step back, take a deep breath, and be rigorous in our analysis and think about what we're actually talking about. There's no such thing as a blockchain. There are hundreds of blockchains. In other words, every currency, every token, every so-called smart contract, if you're using Ether, has a different blockchain. So there are at least hundreds, perhaps thousands of blockchains, new ones being created every day. So again, don't talk to me about blockchain. Tell me which specific blockchain you're talking about, because they're not all the same, and this is critical. The main difference, there are many differences in this blockchain technology, but the main difference is validation. Because remember, the whole idea of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the original Bitcoin and what Satoshi Nakamoto came up with is that we're going to have a trustless system. We're not going to trust banks. We're not going to trust clearinghouses. We're not going to trust exchanges. We're not going to trust central banks. We're not going to trust anybody. We're going to have a decentralized system that a community can validate, and we don't have to rely on anybody in particular. That was the original idea. So the question is, what's your method of validation? And that's what distinguishes one blockchain from the other. So I've listed 4 of them here, but there are others. Proof of work, that's what blockchain uses. And you know what the work is? You got to factor these, 87-digit prime numbers into prime factors. It's a lot of computer crunching, completely clunky, completely inefficient, non-sustainable. I'll talk about that in a second, but that's Bitcoin. There's something else called proof of stake, meaning this is what Ether is based on. You demonstrate that you have a certain percentage of the processing power, so you step up based on your stake. There's proof of space. Space is storage space on a hard drive, so I get to vote on the blockchain. I get to vote on validating the blockchain because I've decided to devote a certain amount of my hard drive to that process. There's a new coin called Space Mint. And then there's the Byzantine Agreement, or Byzantine Agreement. There's a version of that called the Federated Byzantine Agreement, which I personally think is the best, much more robust to some of the problems we're talking about, and there are others. But the point is, don't talk about blockchain. Say, okay, what's your governance model? What's your validation model, et cetera? And then ask yourself, is that sustainable? Is that robust? Will that resist an attack? Are your cryptocurrencies going to be stolen? These are the questions you have to ask yourself, and there are no generic answers. So I cannot emphasize enough. Coin by coin. I hate to use the word coin, whatever, token by token, blockchain by blockchain. Be rigorous and ask yourself what's sustainable. Now, Bitcoin, Ripple, and Ether, and some of these other cryptocurrencies, not all of them, but the best known are going to fail. When I say fail, they're going to, Bitcoin might have a $200 value as a token for criminals. I think criminals and terrorists might find a use case at about $200 per Bitcoin, but they're basically not going to be anywhere near where they are today. Why do I say that? I don't want to make a claim without backing it up. The first point is they're non-scalable. Transaction times are slow. And then when you say that to Bitcoin people, they go, aha, the Lightning Network is right around the corner. Lightning's going to, we'll see. They said that about segregated witness. They said that about some of these other solutions. They don't seem to get community support. They keep forking the Bitcoin, meaning one day you wake up and there's 2 blockchains instead of 1, or whatever happened to that whole idea that we weren't going to have inflation and we weren't going to pull new cryptos out of thin air. But these solutions, you have to understand what the solution is. So what they're saying is, nobody has a solution for the inherent slowness, clunkiness, non-scalability of the original Bitcoin blockchain. There's no solution for that. So when you hear about solutions, what are they? Well, what they're saying is take a bunch of transactions offline. So everybody in the room could form a group, or let's say every coffee shop in Brooklyn, New York, every coffee shop in Vancouver could form a group. And all the people who want to buy coffee would join that group. And we would agree, so we're in our own little bubble over here, and we would agree that all of our Bitcoin transactions among each other don't go on the blockchain. They just get settled in this sort of separate cloud over here, and then we net them out. So, I pay you 5 Bitcoin, and you pay the person next to you 4, and he pays the lady in the back of the room 10, and she pays me 7, and we net it out, and then periodically, and it could be daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever, we net all this stuff out, and then we take that net and we put that on the blockchain, so that the amount of transactions that have to go on the blockchain is greatly reduced. That's true. But what are we doing? We've created our own network. I got to trust the coffee shops. How do I know they're not going to steal my money? In other words, it's only a solution because you're completely negating the original idea. Oh, sure. If you want to tear up the original idea and start over, that's fine. But don't tell me you're adhering to the idea of a decentralized, trustless network, because you're not. All you've done is create another network. Somebody, I get trolled on Twitter all the time. People tell me I'm an idiot and I don't know technology and all that stuff. And then my more sour modes, I tell them I was coding before they were born. But as far as some of these things are concerned, somebody said, well, you don't understand payment channels, and I actually do. And I said, yeah, I understand payment channels. We had those in the 50s. They were called party lines, which is, you pick up the phone and someone's talking, you got to ask them to get off the phone so you could go. In other words, there was an AT&T network, at least in the United States, but other people could jump in on this little side thing. That's all it is. These are party lines. So that doesn't work. Non-sustainable. The energy usage to solve the problem and make the proof of work in Bitcoin is now greater than the annual energy output of Ireland. Imagine taking all the electricity used in Ireland in a year, and that's how much we have to use to crunch numbers. By the way, every applied mathematician will tell you that prime factoring is a trivial problem. It's like an uninteresting problem. But it takes a lot of computing power to do it because the numbers are so big and the possibilities are so great. So we're just wasting the entire electrical usage of Ireland. In a few years, it's going to be the entire electrical usage of Japan. Who in this room thinks that governments are going to allow Bitcoin miners to use as much electricity in a year as the entire country of Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world? That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not very green. It's completely wasteful. In other words, it can't happen. So that's why I say it's non-sustainable. It's going to hit a wall. Non-regulated, I don't have to remind you of all the frauds, new ones popping up every day. And it's not just exchanges. Exchanges are, how do exchanges work? I want to go to a Bitcoin exchange. Well, you got to go in, you got to open an account, just like Merrill Lynch or Charles Schwab, right? So, or Toronto Dominion. So you go, you give me your name, your address, your social security number, your bank wire information, give them all that information, and then send them dollars. And they say, okay, you got some Bitcoin, here's your confirmation. Really? How do I know you didn't just take my dollars and send me a phony baloney confirmation? How do I know you're not, a Ponzi? You're using new money to pay off the old money. How do I know you're not Bernie Madoff with a computer engineering degree? How do I know you're not a bucket shop? How do I know any of those things? The answer is you don't. So good luck with that. Not to mention Bitcoin whales. They estimate there are 1,000 people who control 40% of the Bitcoin. Now you got millennials buying, 1/100th of a Bitcoin for, $10 or whatever the math is, $100. But you got these, I call them the whales, these 1,000 people who have 40% of all the Bitcoin. You don't think they have a big vested interest in keeping the price up? And you don't think they wash trade, do wash sales? So A sells to B for 10,000, B sells back for 11,000, A sells back for 12,000, B sells back for 13,000. This is called painting the tape. It's the oldest trick in the book. And there's no profit and loss because we're selling the same Bitcoin back and forth. But what we are doing is creating a ticker that gets the millennials, I shouldn't pick up millennials, 3 millennial children, but gets people all over the world, maybe a garage mechanic in South Korea took out a home equity loan or hawked his inventory, put his entire life savings into Bitcoin and has now been wiped out and is desperate and suicidal. That's what's going on. It's basically rich people stealing from the poor. Not a good business model in my view. And then finally, there's no use case other than criminals, terrorists, or tax evaders. Why is Bitcoin better than Visa unless you're a criminal? Now, if you're a criminal, I get it. If you're buying child pornography, you want to use the dark web and use some cryptos and all that. And if you try doing that with Visa, you'll probably get a call from the FBI. So I understand why it's good for criminals. But if you're not a criminal, if you're not a tax evader, if you're not buying child pornography, if you're not an arms dealer, if you're not a terrorist, then why is Bitcoin better than Visa? There's really no use case for it other than crime. And then it's non-elastic. And this is important because there's a finite number of Bitcoins, 21 million Bitcoin. They're getting closer to that level every day. And everyone's like, this is a good thing because, the problem with central banks is they print all this money and we're going to have inflation. By the way, we haven't had any inflation for the last 8 years. Separate issue, I'll come to that if we don't run out of time. But, we hate central banks. They print too much money, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to cap the number of Bitcoin. But money supply has to be elastic. It can't be too elastic. The problem with central bank money is that it's too elastic. The reason, by the way, gold is such a good form of money is that it grows slowly. It grows at about the tempo of world growth. It grows at about the tempo of population growth. Not exactly, but close enough that it's the best form of money anyone's ever discovered. But the problem with Bitcoin, when you hit a hard stop, which they will, and the economy keeps growing, but you want to back it with Bitcoin, so here's your money supply and here's your economy, that's inherently deflationary, right? Because each Bitcoin's got to support more and more growth, meaning your Bitcoin is worth more in theory, but the problem is you never get there. Why? Because if you have a deflationary currency, there's no bond market. The money supply grows based on credit, based on loans, based on various forms of borrowing. The money supply is just a foundation, and the economy grows with credit. Nobody wants to borrow in a form of money that's going to be more expensive when you pay it back. I'm not talking about interest. That's always part of the equation. But I'm saying the money itself is worth more when you have to pay back the loan. No one's going to borrow on that loan, therefore no bond market, therefore no viable form of money. So these are all the reasons why this is going to hit the wall. It's going up a lot. And let me just back that up a little bit because that's easy to say. I don't say things like that without a lot of analysis. There are 3 different ways to think about it. One is just some technical analysis. This is the 3rd great bull market in gold in history. And when I say history, I'm only going back to 1971 because prior to 1971, gold was money. So you didn't have a bull market or a bear market. It was fixed to the dollar. The people who bang the table and say, give me a gold standard, I was like, well, be careful what you wish for, because in a gold standard, you're not going to make any money on gold because it's fixed, it's pegged to the dollar. If you want to make money on gold, you would actually be against a gold standard because they keep screwing up the currency and the gold goes up. But we had a bull market from 1971 to 1980 and gold went up 2,700%. Then we had a bear market from 1980 to 1999, and gold went down from $800 to $250. So that's, do the math, that's 60 or 70%. Then we had the second great bull market from 1999 to 2011, and gold went up 670%. Then we had a bear market. It's so funny how these things go in cycles. From 2011 to 2015, but you can call the bottom. It was December 16th, 2015. Gold was $1,050 an ounce. I'm talking US dollars. That was the bottom. And I saw it at the time, and I called it at the time based on a conversation I had with Jim Rogers, who's the greatest commodities trader in history. And we were down in the Dominican Republic at Casa de Campo during the bear market. And I said, Jim, what do you think about gold? He goes, well, I own it. But I'm not buying more at the moment. I'm waiting. He said, I'm not selling it, but I'm not buying more. I'm waiting. And he said to me something that just hit me right between the eyes. He said, gold is going to the moon. But no commodity goes to the moon without a 50% retracement along the way. There comes a time when it drops 50%, and then there's like the second liftoff, and then it goes to the moon. Now, take the bottom in 1999, it was $250 an ounce. The top was $1,900 an ounce in August 2011. So that's $1,750. Half of that, so 50% retracement would be down $825. So 1,900 minus 825 puts you at 1,075. Well, bingo, 1,050. That's close enough for government work, as we say. So when I saw 1,050, I talked to Jim Rogers about this earlier. When I saw 1,050, I said, okay, there's your 50% retracement. Using 250 you have to have a base. Using 250 as your baseline, up to 1,900, take that gap, down 50%, boom, 1,075, we were 1,050. I said, that's the low. Now it's getting close to 1,900 again. I mean, actually, on an intraday basis, I think it just kind of kissed the all-time high. It was like right there. So there's the full retracement of the bear market. But this bull market, the third grade bull market, started December 2015. We are up almost 90%. You go from 1,050 to 1,900. That's about 90%, 86, 87%. Yeah. But bear in mind, the last two bull markets, remember what I said, 2,700% and 670%. So 85% is great. But when you get into like 600, 700, 800%, or 2,000%, you're talking about $15,000 by 2025. So if we just did the average of the two prior bull markets, I'm not even talking about the higher of the two. Take the two bull markets, average the duration and the gain, and then apply it to December 2015. You get to the exact number is $15,000 by 2025, $15,000 an ounce by 2025. But people go, that's 4 years away. It's like 5 years away. I was like, yeah, but to get to from 2,000 to 15,000, you got to go 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. You can make a ton of money. So that's where it's going. Now, could it go down tomorrow? Sure. I mean, the gold's volatile. I don't get too hung up on it because I'm kind of a buy and hold person. You know, I don't get too euphoric when it goes up, but I don't get depressed when it goes down. In fact, when it goes down, I like to see it go up for our listeners and our readers. But personally, I don't mind when it goes down because you can buy more at a cheaper price. Because I know it's going up. I know where it's going. So the answer is, and just a little, again, sixth grade math is usually sufficient. When you get to higher levels, a fixed dollar increase is a smaller percentage increase. So people go, oh, it went from 1,800 to 1,900. It went to 2,000, 2,100, 20, and that's a big deal and good for all of us. But those $100 increments get to be more and more frequent and more common because they start looking like 1/2 of 1%. 1/2 of 1% is not a big deal in the market. So you're going to see that on a daily basis. So my advice to people, of course, is buy gold. But I said that at 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, 1,500, 1,600. You know, I've said it all along, and people don't buy it. People also accuse me. They say, "Well, Jim, you're just talking your position. You know, you're just trying to sell gold." I'm not a dealer. I don't make any money. If you buy gold, good for you. But I'm not in the business. I'm a writer. I'm an analyst, but I'm not a gold dealer. I'm actually one of the few analysts, apart from yourself and a few others, who are not gold dealers. But I think that gives you more credibility because you're not selling gold, you're understanding gold. But for anyone who hasn't bought it yet, of course, denial is a powerful thing. They'll say, well, I missed the boat. Now it's up the side, it's going to go down. You haven't missed the boat. I mean, again, 80, 90% is a good run, but this is going to go multiples of that.
All right, let's dive a bit deeper into what we've covered about gold. So we've been seeing gold prices going up quite a bit lately, and there are a few factors behind this trend that we can break down. Firstly, when we look back at the history of gold prices since 1971, we can identify three major periods where gold prices surged. These periods are often referred to as bull markets, and they're characterized by sustained increases in the price of gold. The most recent bull market began in 2015 when gold prices were relatively low. Since then, we've witnessed a significant uptrend, with gold prices rising by almost 90%. However, if we compare this current increase to the previous bull markets, it might seem a bit modest. For instance, in the past, we've seen gold prices skyrocket by 2,700% and 670%, making the current surge seem comparatively smaller. Now, looking ahead to the future, some experts are making bold predictions about where gold prices could be headed. There's talk of gold reaching a staggering $15,000 per ounce by 2025. That's a substantial jump from where prices stand today. But, of course, we have to consider that the path to that price level may not be smooth sailing. Gold prices can be quite volatile, meaning they can experience significant fluctuations in the short term. Despite this volatility, many investors still view gold as a valuable asset to have in their portfolios. That's because gold has a reputation for holding its value over time, especially when other investments might be struggling. So, if you're thinking about adding gold to your investment mix, it could be worth considering for the long term. In essence, the story of gold is one of resilience and opportunity. While we can't predict exactly where gold prices will go in the future, understanding the historical trends and current market dynamics can provide valuable insights for investors looking to navigate the world of commodities trading.
Just to take a really simple example, let's say that there was, the bar of gold in front of us, and I wanted to sell it to you, you wanted to buy it. We would go back and forth over the price. We'd agree on a price, and we'd sell that bar. But what if we had one bar of gold, and just make up, let's say a 1 ounce gold coin, so $1,400. And I said, okay, Lynette, I could sell you the 1 ounce gold coin for $1,400, but why don't I sell you 100 ounces? I only have 1 ounce sitting here, but we'll make the other 99 a paper contract. And we'll agree that either I pay you or you pay me, depending on where the price goes from here. So bear in mind, we only have 1 ounce of physical gold, but we do a deal on 100 ounces, 99 ounces of paper gold and 1 ounce of physical gold. Well, that's a much bigger deal, a lot more money involved, a lot more profit and loss for either one of us. But there's still only 1 ounce of gold. The other 99 is the derivative. So a derivative is just a paper bet. It's a paper bet based on some underlying with no limit as to how big the paper bet can be. Now, I'll give you another concrete example. I remember in 2007 when the mortgage crisis first hit in the spring, and then there was a money market crisis in August, and that's when Jim Cramer had his famous meltdown with Aaron Burnett on CNBC. They know nothing, but the point being, that was the beginning, and then it came to a head over a year later with Lehman Brothers in September 2018. But when it first started, there were some very smart people, and I would put, Ben Stein and others. He's an economist and he's a comedian, actor, but also an economist. And a lot of other people said, look, there are $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, and that's about what there was with Alt-A. That's another kind of subprime, but let's say $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. In the mortgage market, 5% is a huge default rate. When default rates get to 5%, people are kind of panicking. He said, let's get crazy. Let's assume a 20% default rate. It never got that high, but he said, just assume it. Well, 20% of 1 trillion is 200 billion. So he said, even if this thing gets totally out of control, we'll have 200 billion in losses, which was about the same in real terms as the S&L crisis in the 1980s. That was about 135 billion of losses. So adjusted for inflation, it would be $200 billion by 2007. And Stein said, well, we survived the 1980s. We can survive this. It's about the same. What he was missing was that, there were $1 trillion of mortgages, but there were $6 trillion of derivatives on the mortgages, on the same mortgages. And so 20% default rate, it wasn't 200 billion, it was 1.2 trillion of losses just to get started. And then the panic went on from there, and the losses were ultimately in the scores of trillions. Right. But the point being, you cannot look at bank balance sheets. You cannot look at futures contracts. You cannot look at any known quantity and understand the risk without understanding how much is off balance sheet, how much more of the same thing, the same kind of bet. And banks do not put derivatives on their balance sheet. And I've had this debate in chapter 8 of the book, chapter 8 of Aftermath. I talk about a private briefing that I had with the board of directors of Morgan Stanley and their CEO, James Gorman. And I said, well, first of all, a couple things. Number one, your derivative book might be smaller, it actually was, but that's because so many of the derivatives were moved over to the clearinghouses. They created these clearinghouses after 2008. So now, two banks do a derivative trade, and they take it and they send it to the clearinghouse, and you put it on the balance sheet of the clearinghouse. You didn't make the risk go away. You just moved it to a side pocket. So yeah, maybe Morgan Stanley or Citibank's balance sheet has fewer derivatives, but it doesn't mean there are fewer derivatives in the system. They've just been put over in the clearinghouse. Who's going to guarantee the clearinghouse? Again, Morgan Stanley's capital base may be fine, at least in most circumstances, but who's backing up the clearinghouse? Well, the answer is the members, which are the banks. So if the clearinghouse gets in distress, they're going to turn to their members and say, hey, give us capital, at a time when the banks are like, oh, we can't do that because we need all the capital we can get. So first of all, you're undercounting derivatives when you ignore the clearinghouses, number one. Number two, and this was the point I made, so look, as a bank, you may be stronger, but you're part of a system, and the system is more vulnerable. And if the system goes down, you go down with it. I don't care how strong your balance sheet is. You're part of something bigger, and if that collapses, you collapse too. And I said, look, you're running a bank. You can't take responsibility for the whole world. That, in theory, is the responsibility of regulators and central bankers and others. But they don't know any more about risk than Wall Street does. I mean, everyone's ignoring the risks or not computing the risk properly. So I say, yeah, maybe your bank's more sound, but you're not counting the clearinghouse, and you're ignoring systemic risk, which is bigger and more dangerous than ever. The warning signs are all over the place. You just have to understand them, incorporate them, connect the dots, and then see how it plays out. And it's not just one path or multiple paths, but they all sort of end up in the same place. And then I bring it full circle. I say, well, if this is coming, and it is, what are you waiting for? Why not get ready now? When I've had people say, I'll be half facetious, but it's kind of true. They say, Jim, I hear you, I agree with you, but I'm making too much money in the stock market. Could you call me at 3 o'clock the day before the crash, and I'll sell my stocks and buy some gold? And I say, well, first of all, I'm not going to know the day. I can tell you it's coming, but I don't know the day. And if I did, I'd probably be a little busy myself. But the point is, when you most want your gold, when the panic hits and everyone like, get me out of stocks, get me out of money market funds, I want gold, you're actually not going to be able to get it. You're not going to be able to get the gold. The dealers won't talk to you if they don't already know you. The mint will be back ordered. The dealers will be back ordered. You will not be able to get people on the phone. So why wait for that? Do it now while you can.
Right. It is, because there's, you were talking earlier about people selling their stocks and their money markets and all of these and buying gold before the crisis hits. But will there be any buyers on the other side of any of these assets?
Well, that's right. And this is what I talk. Well, that's correct. Now, this is what I talk about in chapter 4 of the book, how more and more assets under management have moved to passive investment styles. Yes. That means index funds and ETFs and things like that. Well, when passive investing started, when it began, I analogize it to like a mosquito lands on the back of an elephant. Well, the mosquito has a good time and the elephant doesn't even notice. So passive index funds were basically piggybacking on active investors who were committing capital, taking risk, and making markets, engaging in price discovery, and you could just kind of go along for the ride. But what happens when it's not one mosquito, it's a billion mosquitoes? The answer is the elephant dies. And that's what's happening in markets. More and more funds are going passive, fewer and fewer are going active. Well, the active investors are the ones who commit capital and make markets. So you get into a financial panic with the passive investors. Their investors want their money back, so they have to sell stocks or sell assets or sell bonds to get money to pay the redemptions. Well, where are the buyers? You've driven the active managers out of business. They're not going to be heroes like firemen rushing to a fire. They're going to walk away, and so the market's going to go no bid, and it's going to go straight down. In 2020, they were back to where they started in 2013, except worse, because the balance sheet was even bigger. It's not going to take 7 years this time. It might be more like 7 months. And the reason is twofold. Number one, we're more leveraged and the stock market is more bubbly. And so the whole thing's more vulnerable. Number two, the market has seen this movie before. Like, hey, we watched this play out. We know it doesn't work. And the Fed balks. Now, so if the Fed suddenly slams on the brakes, says we're not going to keep raising rates along the lines I projected earlier, okay, that might give the stock market a boost. And you can't assume that won't happen. You got to watch for that. But I would expect that things would have to get pretty ugly in all events before the Fed got that message. On the other hand, if Powell gets confirmed and feels like it's his last term and here's his chance to be Paul Volcker and he's just going to keep raising rates, he said, my job is to get inflation under control. The rest of you people, you're responsible for fiscal policy and tax policy and spending and, shutting down the Keystone Pipeline.
Welfare.
All that. That's on you, not me. My job is to get rid of inflation. If he does that, and he might, you're looking at a recession, kind of looks like the global financial crisis, and hope it doesn't. And there's a difference between extreme recession and financial crisis. They're two different things, but they can happen at the same time as did happen in 2008.
In this video, Jim Rickards talks about the challenges and potential risks faced by the Federal Reserve in managing the economy. The central theme revolves around the delicate balance that the Fed must strike between preventing a stock market crash and avoiding a severe recession. Jim raises concerns about the Fed's ability to have perfect information, citing flawed models and the possibility of being behind the curve in recognizing economic challenges. The distinction between a recession and a financial crisis is highlighted, with historical examples used to illustrate that these two phenomena can occur independently. Jim Rickards emphasizes the difficulty the Fed might face in choosing between preventing a financial crisis or accepting a recession as a trade-off. The reference to Paul Volcker's actions in the 1980s adds historical context, showcasing a deliberate choice to induce a severe recession for the purpose of combating inflation. However, Jim Rickards notes that the current economic landscape is more intricate, with additional considerations such as systemic risks and the potential for a recession triggering a financial crisis. In conclusion, Jim Rickards underscores the complex decisions the Federal Reserve must make, acknowledging the uncertainties and trade-offs inherent in steering the economy and avoiding undesirable outcomes. Before we get into the video, can you help me to give that like button a little touch? All right, let's get into it.
Would the Fed back off if it became apparent that they were going to cause a stock market crash, a disorderly collapse, and a severe recession? The answer is almost certainly yes. But the problem is it might happen anyway. In other words, they might have gone too far. And this almost happened in 2018, and that was my point. It was that by the time they realized their mistake, it might already be too late. So that's one danger, if they had perfect information, oh, gee, we went too far, gee, we couldn't pull this off, we need to back off. They might back off exactly as you described, but they don't have perfect information. They have flawed models. They tend not to look at history, and they could
behind the curve.
They could crash the car before they knew it was out of control. It's like slamming on the brakes on ice. You can slam on the brakes, but you're going to go for a long time before the car stops. So that's one problem. The second problem is you have to separate, as I said, recession, even severe recessions, from financial crises. In 1998, we had a financial crisis, but no recession. In 1994, we had a financial crisis, no recession. In 2020, we had a severe recession, no financial crisis. That was not a financial crisis. In 2001, we had the NASDAQ collapsed 80%, but there was only a very mild recession, and that was not a financial crisis. So the Fed might say, and again, might, because who knows, but they might say, well, of course we don't want a financial crisis. Now, to your point, Nick, nobody wants that, and they do get out of control. But we're not worried about that. You know, we learned our lesson in 2008. We had Dodd-Frank. And I had this discussion with James Gorman, the CEO of Morgan Stanley. I briefed their board, and they gave me a lot of pushback. They said, "Oh, you don't understand, Jim. We have more capital and greater liquidity and less leverage and better credit." And I granted that. I said, you're absolutely right. I said, nice job. You're a stronger bank now than you were then. But in a financial crisis, it doesn't matter. The problem is systemic. In other words, as an individual bank, you may be better off. But if the whole system's collapsing, you can't necessarily withstand that. So they don't want that. But what if they said to themselves, you know what, we don't want a financial crisis, but we don't think that's going to happen. But maybe we'll just have to bear a recession. Volcker knew what he was doing. Volcker knew that there was going to be a recession. And the recession of 1981-82 that he caused was, at the time, the worst since the Great Depression. Now, we've surpassed that twice since then, 2008 and 2020, although it's hard to know what 2020 was. I mean, down 36% in 2 months and up 38% the next 2 months. I mean, what is that? But at least in technical terms, we've had two worse recessions, 2008 and 2020 since then. But at the time, and I lived through that, I was around, that was the worst recession. But Volcker knew that would happen. He said, that's the price we have to pay to break the back of inflation. And he did. And by 1986, inflation was like 2% or 1.8%. Now, there was far less worry about financial crises at the time. Because remember, this was before the repeal of Glass-Steagall. Commercial banks, no one really cared about investment banks. They could fail. So what? They cared about the commercial banks, and they had a pretty good handle on that. So they weren't worried about financial crisis. But today you would be for the reasons we mentioned. So there are two possible major blunders here, but again, don't underestimate the Fed's ability to do both. One is that they could decide they don't want a recession, but not know until it was too late. They just tighten into it, don't know it until it's too late, and then the damage is done. The other one is they could sign up for a recession, say, yeah, sorry, but that's the price of getting inflation under control, and trigger a financial crisis that nobody wants but could happen anyway. So, it's kind of so and Charybdis, take your pick. Severe recession, but we know it's coming. Recession that causes a financial crisis that we didn't want, or just let the inflation rip. What's the good outcome there? What's the good one?
Yeah.
But I think those are the three choices. I think you're right.
In the face of these complexities, our discussion leaves us with three potential scenarios: the risk of unwittingly tightening into a recession, the prospect of accepting a recession for inflation control, or the challenging choice of allowing inflation to run rampant. The Federal Reserve stands at a crossroads, and the decisions they make in the coming months may well shape the economic landscape for years to come. As we conclude our exploration, it becomes clear that the path ahead is fraught with challenges and decision-making. The balancing act between preventing a stock market crash and avoiding an unintentional recession places the Federal Reserve in a formidable position. The lessons from 2018 serve as a stark reminder that perfect information eludes them, and the consequences of their decisions may only become apparent once it's too late to correct. The historical perspective sheds light on the dual nature of economic downturns, where financial crises and recessions don't always go hand in hand. Drawing parallels to Paul Volcker's bold strategy in the 1980s, we ponder whether the Fed might consider accepting a recession as a necessary sacrifice for taming inflation.
These are the early signs of a global liquidity crisis, which is different than a recession and different than called a plain vanilla, financial crisis. The liquidity crisis, is when you get ready to turn off the lights. There's a dollar shortage around the world, and people say, how can that be? The Fed printed, $7 trillion of money, M0, actually higher than that. I think we went up to 9 trillion. They just flooded the zone with money. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, they did print, over $7 trillion of base money, so-called M0. But that money didn't go anywhere. How does the Fed print money? Well, they buy bonds from dealers, from the big banks, the so-called primary dealers. So the open market desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York calls up Goldman Sachs. They offer me 10-year notes. Goldman says, here's a price. Okay, done. Goldman delivers the notes to the to the Fed, and the Fed pays Goldman. And that money comes out of thin air. That is money printing. But then Goldman takes the money and gives it back to the Fed as excess reserves. It doesn't go into the real economy. Nobody borrows it, nobody spends it, nobody lends it. All that happens is at the Fed, you're building up both sides of the balance sheet. You're building up the asset side with U.S. Treasury securities, and you're building up the liability side with deposits from the primary dealers in the form of excess reserves. So that money doesn't do anything. I mean, it's printed, if you want to say that, but it has not caused inflation. The inflation comes from, as I discussed earlier, from the supply side, the price of oil, supply chain disruptions, wheat, food, gasoline, et cetera. The inflation is flooding in, and it's exacerbated by fiscal policy. Now, you have to, what I just described about the money printing, that's monetary policy. Okay. But fiscal policy, which is the 5 or 6 or probably $7 trillion of deficit spending, that's helicopter money. When the federal government and the Congress and the Treasury hand out checks That's helicopter money. That's not like giving Goldman money and then Goldman gives it back to you. Forget that. It doesn't do anything. I mean, it exists. It doesn't do anything. But when the government hands out checks, that's real. Now, some people saved them during the pandemic. A lot of millennials opened accounts on Robinhood and started trading cryptos. They could, kiss that money goodbye. But more recently, that money has been spent, and that's when the inflation really took off. So that was driven not by monetary policy; it was driven by fiscal policy. But getting back to the strong dollar, there's something else going on, which is the entire international monetary system is driven not by the Fed, but by Eurodollars, by money that banks lend to each other so that they can support their balance sheets and lend to customers or offer transactions to customers if they will. And the main transactions is approximately $1 quadrillion of derivatives, options, futures, forwards, swaps, swaptions, I could go on and on. All of that, almost all of it, has to be backed up by collateral. I could say, if I'm a hedge fund and you're Morgan Stanley and I call you up and say, Addison, I want a $5 billion total return equity swap, which is basically a derivative basket of stocks, and I can buy and sell stocks all day long up to 5 billion, but it'll be notional. You'll pay me the profit or loss and dividends, but I don't actually own the stocks. I just have a $5 billion swap with you. And then you go out and maybe buy the stocks and hedge your position. You'll do that for me if I'm a big enough hedge fund or sovereign wealth fund or institution or whatever, but you want collateral. I don't have to give you $5 billion worth of collateral. I just have to give you enough, a little bit of foundation and the mark-to-market losses. So if I lose money on that deal, I will give you that much collateral. So collateral is the key to the whole quadrillion-dollar structure I described. So what's good collateral? Well, it used to be a lot of things, but today banks are saying to each other, we don't want your corporates, we don't want your stupid mortgages. We want, 2-year treasury notes, maybe with a haircut, or 6-month bills, 4-week bills, 30-day bills, the best, absolute best, most liquid form of collateral. Well, okay. First of all, there's a scarcity of that. There's a collateral shortage, and banks desperate to prop up their balance sheets are asking, we're going to get some treasury bills, and they're bidding for them at prices that produce yields to maturity lower than what the Fed will give you for free. So if I'm a bank and I can call the Fed and the Fed will give me some treasury bills and I give them cash under an agreement to unwind that, and the interest rate on the cash is whatever, why would I go out in the market and bid on a treasury bill that pays me less than what the Fed will give me for a phone call? Why would you do that? The answer is you need the bill. In other words, you don't need an expanded balance sheet. You don't need more credit at the Fed. You need that bill to pledge as collateral on this quadrillion dollars of derivatives. And that's what's happening. So how do I get a bill if I'm Deutsche Bank or Credit Suisse or UBS or UniCredit or Barclays or anybody else? I need dollars. Because the bills are denominated in dollars. So if I want to buy them, I got to get some dollars. So there's this huge bid for dollars that can be used to buy the treasury securities, to pledge as collateral, to prop up the balance sheet. And that's what's going on behind the curtain. That's the plumbing. That's why the dollar is strong, even though everything about the U.S. economy is weak, meaning recession, long-term depression, deficits, trade deficits, political dysfunction, borderline civil war. It's all bad. But if I'm Deutsche Bank, I need those dollars to buy treasury bills to prop up my balance sheet. But if you can't get it, or you can't get it at a price, or the dollar gets too strong, et cetera, or the yields get negative, et cetera, what happens is, and this is happening, the banks are reducing their balance sheets. And it's just a matter of time, in my view, not guaranteed, but one could see a situation where suddenly some major player goes bankrupt. They can't meet a collateral call, or a bank gets in distress, or there's a run on the bank. Now we're back to 2008. This wouldn't look like 2020. This would look like 2008, except worse. Here, the supply side we kind of talked about. So energy shortages because of the Biden energy policy, empty shelves, supply chain breakdowns, bottlenecks at the Port of Los Angeles, not enough truck drivers, higher fuel prices get passed along. I mean, there's everything arrives by truck at the end of the day. It could come by boat or train, but it's somewhere in that delivery chain, those transportation channels, there's a truck, and they run on diesel. And when the price of diesel goes up, the price of everything in the truck goes up, because you got to factor the delivery costs into the cost at the counter. So that's kind of what's going on from the supply side. Demand side inflation, what's called demand pull inflation, is mostly psychological. In those consumers get it in their heads that prices are going up for whatever reason. Maybe they actually are going up and they extrapolate from that, or they have other reasons for believing that. And so what they do is they pull demand forward. And I lived through this in the 70s. This was what was happening in the 1970s. You want to buy a refrigerator or a car, or, a new suit or clothes or anything. And you go, you know what? I better go buy it now, right now, because it's going to be, if I wait 3 months or 6 months, it's going to be a lot more expensive. So you do, but what you're doing, you're pulling all that demand forward, and it feeds on itself. Prices are going up because there's more demand, possibly combined with supply shocks. And then when the prices go up, it validates the narrative. It's like, oh, see, I told you, prices went up, better go buy more. And it just feeds on itself. So, but they're very different. So the Fed, it's one thing to say the Fed can't do anything about the supply side inflation. The Fed can't do anything about it. The Fed doesn't drill for oil. They don't drive trucks. They don't pilot ships, and they don't work farm equipment. They can't do anything about it. They can do something about the demand side, which is destroying demand. So now we're in a situation, by the way, we're not all the way to demand pull inflation yet. In the 70s, it also started on the supply side with the Arab oil embargo in 1973. Then there was a second embargo in 1979 from the Iranians. So those supply shocks did tip over into the demand side, and then it just has a life of its own. We're not at that point yet. We're getting dangerously close. We definitely have it from the supply side. It hasn't yet affected the consumer side of it. In fact, consumers are pulling in their horns. I mean, they say the cure for higher oil prices is higher oil prices. In other words, if the price goes up, people will drive less. Or if you lost your job, you might not be driving at all. So there's another way for those prices to come down, which is the high prices themselves destroy demand by themselves. And then that results in lower prices. And that is happening. We have seen inflation come down a little bit. I know it was higher than a lot of people expected beginning in the middle of last year, but they are starting to come down a little bit right now. But the demand side of it has not yet caught fire. But there is something else the Fed can do. They can destroy demand. So how do they do that? Well, raising interest rates. So what happens? Credit card rates go up, mortgage rates go up, new housing purchases slow down, car financing, leasing rates go up. So people stop buying new cars, et cetera. If you do that enough, you can destroy demand, but it's at a very high cost, because what are you doing? You're putting the economy in a recession. So can the Fed deal with supply side inflation? The answer is yes, by destroying demand and putting the economy in a really severe recession. So nice job, Fed. That's between a rock and a hard place. Let it go. And it'll take a long time to fix the supply side, or crush demand so much that it fixes itself, but at a very high cost. And the Fed is doing the latter. It's a very, very imperfect, blunt instrument, but they are destroying demand. Now, so here's the policy question. Does the Fed know what they're doing? The answer is always no. They never know what they're doing. They pretend they do. They say they do, but they don't really. Do they understand what I just said? Not really. So what are they going to do? They're going to keep raising rates because they got to crush inflation. And that's what Volcker did. Leave aside whether that was really the problem, but that's what he did. So Powell is going to keep raising rates, and they may raise them 75 basis points in September, again in November, again in December, into 2023. And you're like, wait a second, Jim, you said we're in a recession and unemployment is going to start to go up, and there's demand destruction because of higher interest rates. And that may result in declines in housing prices. The inflation may cool off. So why is the Fed raising rates into weakness? And the answer is because they don't get it. They're always the last to know. And they're very political. Don't let anyone tell you that the Fed's not political. So here we have the situation where the inflation is coming from the supply side. Fed can't do much about it. They can destroy demand, but that'll throw us into a recession. So why are you raising rates into what may be both a coming recession and a global liquidity crisis, which we just talked about. The answer is that's crazy. You shouldn't do it, but it's the Fed and they probably will.